All right, we're live. Wow, we are seriously live. Hey, Stephen Dubner.
Hi, Adam Grant.
How are you?
Excellent, thank you.
Why are you here?
I am here with our Freakonomics Radio production crew, Allison Craiglow and Greg Rippin, to do a, I guess what they call them here, a panel tomorrow, but we're going to record a live Freakonomics Radio show.
I meant more in the existential sense, but I'll take that too.
Why am I here in life?
Yeah.
Existentially how? Give me
As
more.
in, why do you do what you do?
Oh. So that was, I misinterpreted you, yeah. Hi. By the way, hello everybody. Why do I do what I do? So I'm a writer by training and by temperament and sentiment. And I don't know how many of you know, I probably shouldn't address them for your podcast, should I?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Pay no attention to the people in the chairs.
So in my experience, most people who become writers like me are people who are incapable of really doing anything useful. I can't make anything. I can't build anything. I can't solve any problems. And so I just follow around people who do those things. But yeah, I really love what I do. And I feel pretty lucky to get to have a life and a career doing something that I enjoy as much as I do, because I know, if you do that, you tend to clump yourself in with other people who do that, and you become a little siloed community that it's easy to believe that that's the way the world operates. And then you look at the data and you see that the vast majority of people in every part of the world don't get much pleasure from their work. So apropos of what you're doing here with this show, I feel ridiculously grateful to take pleasure in my work.
Well, I don't know if you're glad about this, but I'm really thrilled that you didn't end up pursuing your other calling as a musician. But you almost did.
I did. So, I think when I was a kid, like a lot of kids, you envision a future of fun and glamour, and they're not glamour, fun, and like doing what you really want to do and love to do. And so I played sports as a kid, and I played music as a kid, and so I thought it would be, super fun to be a shortstop for the Baltimore Orioles, let's say, which was my team, or to be a rock star. And so because I played music from the time I was a kid, I did pursue it, medium seriously for a while, then got to college and started a band with some guys, and we were, pretty terrible at first and got slightly less terrible and wrote our own stuff and ended up getting a record deal with a major label and moving to New York and starting to make our record. And then it wasn't an overnight decision, but I decided in that process, because it was a long process, and then also I got to meet some bands who were super successful, who were, several steps ahead of where we were, even though we were signed already. And I did not think that that was actually the life that I wanted. And I realized it was like it was an important reckoning for me that a thing that can look very attractive can have costs that are generally hidden. But now I look around the world, I see most people who are really famous, for instance, the costs that come with fame are massive. And yet I think there are a lot of people who, when they're young, they think it would be great to be famous. And when they think about what would be great about it, I think what they think is that, well, the money might be great, the power might be great, the access, but actually fame itself is kind of horrible and costly for most people. So for all those reasons, and also I didn't want a life of constantly, I didn't want to travel all the time, which in music you're going to do. And I also did not like the idea of having a career that was kind of inherently built on being adored or trying to be adored. It's fun. It's fun to do something, to perform and have people enjoy it and praise you for it. But I thought the kind of feedback loop of that as a human was not so healthy. So I stopped.
And then you chose another path where that same feedback loop exists, right?
Well,
you do a stunning amount of writing with your mouth now, right?
It might seem that way. I can see why it seems that way, but actually doing my kind of quote performing, like making radio basically and writing, is like really, really far removed from being an actual performer. So first of all, it's pretty anonymous. You don't have to go around places to do it, and you're not doing it for like applause. So, so I still, I don't blame anyone for wanting to be a performer, be famous, be whatever. I'm totally all about, self-direction and heterogeneous preferences and all that. I love all that. But I also like that I lucked into a career of doing what I wanted to do, which now has a slightly different technical manifestation, radio and podcasting, but it's exactly the same. I interview people, I write about them, I try to figure out things, I seek out new ideas. Occasionally I try to have a new idea. I try to find people who are interesting and smart and who can tell me something I don't know. So it's exactly the same. I mean, when I was a kid, I was the youngest in 8. My dad was a newspaper man, and we had a family newspaper. And as the youngest of 8, it was really hard to get a piece in the paper because I was like 6 and I didn't know anything, and all my older siblings were running the paper. So like I learned from an early age, you have to work really hard to find out interesting stuff. And that's all I do now.
So as someone who's chosen a creative life and also hangs out with a lot of creative people, I thought it'd be really fun to hear your take on whether you have to be mentally ill to be creative. We talk a lot about mad geniuses. Yeah. Where have you landed on that?
So the research that I've seen argues very much that that's not the case. There is a fairly high correlation of mental illness with creative, if you want to call it genius. Genius is on one hand, it's a kind of IQ definition. On the other, it's a kind of metaphoric appraisal. So really, there's a big variance in what we mean by that. But the shortest answer I think I would give is that it is a wild exaggeration and a disservice, I think, to what mental illness actually is, to look at it as a potentially positive driver of creativity. Mm-hmm. Because, while it is true that there have been a lot of very creative people in history who have had mental illness of various forms, there are a lot of people who have had mental illness who are A, not creative, or B, not successful in any way in the world, because mental illness can be incredibly debilitating. So, the way I like to think about it, I talked to, for our creativity series, I talked to the writer Jenny Egan, a novelist, who's a really, really wonderful writer. And she had written about, or maybe spoken about, she had a brother who was a creative guy himself. I believe he was a painter. And he had mental illness and ended up taking his own life. And the conversation with Jenny Egan, who has, it's very painful. She processed it, she's been processing it for years. And the point she made that really resonated with me is, he was hearing voices, literally, that he could not get rid of, whereas she gets paid to imagine voices. He couldn't turn it off. She had to work really hard to turn it on. And if you had asked him, would you rather have this with the mental illness or, the creativity with that or not? Without question. Mm-hmm. So I actually, I don't mean to bristle at the assumption, but I do think it's one of those assumptions that similar, there's a similar one. What about creative people coming from dysfunctional families, mm-hmm. From families with some kind of trauma, however you define that, the death of a parent, early death of a parent, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So again, the research shows that yes, it turns out that a lot of creative people do come from families where there's been a massive dislocation, but you also find a massive dislocation is very common among people who are, let's say, in federal prisons. Mm-hmm. So those are what we think of as pretty disparate populations. In the one case, the dislocation, the death of a parent, whatever, it may break you. And in another case, a different person, it may make you more resilient. So generalizations are hard. That's really the bottom line. Data is really useful for aggregate assessments, and generalizations are hard.
So one of the things I've been intrigued by as I've been looking into this question is Dean Simonson's research, where he shows that being creative is associated with better mental health, actually, that it sparks a lot of joy in most people's lives to feel like they have new ideas. But extreme creativity seems to be associated with mental health risk. And there's a big puzzle right now about which way the causality might flow. right? So does psychopathology actually make it easier to be creative?
Right.
Knowing that, if your work is going to be rejected by your entire field, you have to be slightly mad to be willing to go for it anyway. Or does it go the other way and say, okay, maybe what's going on is that you have a whole bunch of people who are so creative and so out there that they lose touch with reality over time?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I have no idea where the needle will lie on that spectrum. One explanation that I've heard that resonates for me is that if you think about what it takes to be creative, and not like a trailblazing creative genius in the arts or in science or whatnot, but just to be generally creative. To me, I mean, again, creative is a funny word. Some people use innovative, whatever. All labels are kind of yucky and mushy at some point. But if anybody who comes up with new and interesting stuff, let's say, okay, even someone like me, I'm not really creating stuff. I'm not really innovating. I'm not really generating ideas from scratch. But I am trying to look at the world and kind of either make a different order of it, ask questions that haven't been asked. So let's say that what I do is mildly creative, right? Even if you're only mildly creative, I would argue that there can be a really, really, really big benefit in not listening to or caring too much about what other people think about what you're doing, period. Because the minute you start to think, oh, will this be successful? Will it be popular? Will people think I'm blank for asking that kind of question? Will they think I'm rude? Will they think I'm insincere? Whatever. Then it starts to get more and more and more middling, and we kind of do live in a world of a lot of middling stuff. And personally, I'm not that interested in the middling. I'm interested in things that are more interested than middling. And so I do think it takes a certain kind of temperament that can be taught and learned to care a lot less. And so I've been around academics and artists throughout my life who really didn't care at all what people thought about them, even on the personal level. And I do think that I think that the interface between that and mental illness, I think that interface might be pretty close.
Yep.
And therefore, I could see how the arrow would travel in that direction. Although I bet you could probably come up with an equally, if not more compelling argument for why the arrow would travel in the opposite direction.
No, excuse me. I think that's interesting. I think, when we talk about artists, it reminds me of this recent Grady and Lieberman study where they look at artists' depressive periods in their lives and what happens to their paintings after they're depressed. Excuse me. So, long story short, they code depressive periods by whether you've lost, as an artist, a friend or a family member in the previous year. And they find that the painting that you do during that period, it's actually worth less, and it's less likely to be displayed in a major museum. And you could say maybe they just chose really morbid topics during those periods. But I think another explanation is that when people are depressed, they become more self-focused, and they are less concerned with what the audience thinks. And that makes me wonder if you think that can go too far. If you don't care at all what anybody thinks of your work, doesn't that mean sometimes you privilege your own taste over what might be good?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I guess, short answer, yes. Short answer, extremism in any form is almost always going to be counterproductive at some point. So this gets into the notion of feedback, and feedback in every realm is different. So I think one reason that sports is really engrossing is that it is sort of a proxy for war often, right? So if you go back to earlier civilization, the fact is that we make a lot less mayhem now than we ever have in any point in history, and I think that's generally a pretty good thing. And sport does, I think, satisfy some of the instincts. Whether they're tribal instincts or battling instincts or just superiority instincts or whatnot. So that's pretty cool. But
so are you saying all these people here were drawn to the MIT War Analytics Conference and they don't know it?
Pretty much, yeah. No, but then there are other sports, like golf is not very warlike, I have to say. So there are many different kinds of sports, many different activities. But one thing that makes sports, I think, compelling for certain kinds of people is you can put a number on things, and that's really satisfying. So for feedback, like if I'm, let's say, a golfer, and I'm working on just my downswing and getting the hips out of the way, I can look at the launch monitor and see the spin rate. and it doesn't lie. And so you can have a little bit of argument about, how important is spin rate, how important is launch angle, et cetera, but it's pretty much math. However, feedback in other realms, like in the creative realms, in fact, feedback in the creative realms often seems like in the arts. If you look at the art world for the past 150 years, if you came down from a different planet and didn't know anything, you might expect that that all you really need to be is outlandish, and if you can upset people, it's actually massively helpful from a market perspective, and that's kind of true. So that's an interesting feedback input. So that said, feedback and how feedback works is so domain dependent. But that said, I love feedback, and I think it's really important. So for what I do, we get a lot of feedback, and the tricky part is just deciding at some point, not deciding at some point, is trying to assess what's noise and what's signal. And I learned, I had a really good experience. I went to graduate school for fiction writing. I got an MFA in fiction writing, and we would do workshops where people would bring in their manuscripts, and everybody would read them ahead of time, and then people would give feedback. And the variance from person to person was so massive. And then I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to bring in a piece of literature that everybody, if you told them what it was, everybody said, oh, of course, Anna Karenina, whatever, great, great, great novel, whatever name it. And I thought, if you were to bring in that manuscript with nobody's name on it, and you had 20 people, you'd probably have 12 who'd say, God, overwritten, Train, come on, so melodramatic, et cetera, et cetera. So I learned then, and this was really valuable, that at some point when you are the creative person, you need to develop not a moral compass, but a creative compass. So you need to understand that there are going to be times when someone is shouting in your left ear, this is an absurd idea, you should stop it right now. And maybe nobody's shouting in your right ear except yourself. This could potentially be really interesting. Yeah. And you better work really hard to make it hit that height. But I think a lot of people get crippled by any negative feedback, and then they pull back, and then they decide not to make anything at all. And that's a bummer. You got to learn to shut out or ignore or figure out that you know better.
Well, this goes to a few things that I wanted to talk about. One is back on the mental illness point. It seems like extreme creativity is riskier in low consensus fields. In creative areas where you don't have a lot of agreement between experts. And again, I think that applies to both stories that we told, right? On the one hand, maybe you have to be a little bit more ill in order to tolerate that kind of, hey, most people hate my work, but I believe in it anyway. Or maybe the fact that nobody ever tells you your work is any good is sort of maddening over time. I think there's a puzzle though for most of us who try to do creative work, which is we're pretty bad at judging our own ideas. I have a former student, Justin Berg, who just finished some really interesting research where he shows that if you were to take all your ideas, let's say you've got 20 ideas for your next book, and you rank them from favorite to least favorite, your favorite idea is not your most promising. Apparently, you're too in love with it to see the flaws. It's your second favorite idea, where you have a little bit more distance from it, you can see it more objectively, you recognize what's wrong with it, but you also have enough passion for it to want to fix it. And so I'm getting afraid that people are going to start gaming this system and say, wait, so if I just take my favorite idea and rank it second, then I'm good. So don't do that, right? But how do you think about getting better at that calibration task and knowing when the idea you love is actually not that good?
Yeah, it's a really good question and hard. So I don't have a good answer. I mean, one advantage of having a regular show, so I have a weekly show, and there is something... There are a lot of things good and bad about that. Bad is that you need a good idea every week, and therefore you're more likely to put up with an idea that really isn't that good. What's good is it is a deadline and it is an incentive to constantly work really hard to come up with good ideas. And so I'd say that for every idea that we end up doing, there were probably 10 to 20 that got into some stage of thinking about and were abandoned as being bad. So, but because of my structure in that, there is a kind of mechanism for acceptance or rejection. But then there's a middle ground. Then there's an idea, like we'll have an idea, we'll start producing it, we'll start interviewing people, and it's just like boring. So for me, I have a very selfish set of criteria. It needs to be interesting to me. It needs to be potentially fun for me. And by fun, I don't mean like laughing fun. I mean like it has to be interviews that I look forward to doing. It has to be writing that I look forward to doing. It has to be something that I feel has not been robustly picked over many, many times. Because when I started in journalism, the easiest way to make it as a journalist is to be some kind of beat person, to write about sports or write about politics or write about crime. And I did a bunch of all that, and it was all kind of fun. But the more involved you get in the beat, the more you feel your idea generating part of your brain atrophy, because all you're doing is like, these are the things that are going to be written about. And that just felt to me too uncreative. So I have what are, for me internally, a set of what seem to be fairly high bars. I'm sure they're not high at all, but what I don't do too much is try to use listener data to determine topics. Because I think that while listeners might like that or might think they like it, I know I wouldn't some would, some of their suggestions I might love, but they want to hear, they would want to hear like 20 podcasts on universal basic income in a row. But really, the only people who really there's really only like 0.5% of people who want to hear that, but they tweet a lot. So that's what I mean by like figuring out what's noise and what's real magnitude and what's fake magnitude and so on. But to me, actually, kind of the funnest part of this is like an episode is never more attractive than when it's brand new, hatched in your head, because then it's all upside. And sometimes they come out the way you want them to, and sometimes they don't. But no, to me, like idea generation and like having the idea, thinking about it, what are you going to try to accomplish or contribute, and then for what I do, thinking about what are the elements, who do you want to talk to, what kind of story do you tell, what from history do I know or could we figure out that would be a relevant story to tell within that? What should the tone of the piece be? And always I try to keep the listener in mind or the reader in mind, because that is ultimately what you care about, without feeling like I'm doing it to satisfy them by their standards, which I have no idea. I have to use my standards to try to communicate well for people.
Cool. So I want to do some myth busting, but maybe also a little bit of fad busting. Because one of the things that drives me crazy as an organizational psychologist is walking into a company and finding out that they still use something like the Myers-Briggs. I really wish it had never existed in the first place. That's a different conversation.
Why is
we're not
that?
going to have. I think it's kind of like driving a horse in the era of cars. And like a horse was really great circa 1890, right? It was the fastest vehicle on the market,
except
as
for
far
the
as I
poop.
can tell.
A lot of poop problems. With
Yeah,
the horse.
and I think people got a lot of headaches too.
Yeah,
but
from the noise of horses, horseshoe noise on pavement. You mean?
Oh no, I was assuming from all the jostling around and bumping.
Oh, is that true?
I don't know. I guess I've never ridden horse and carriage before. Now that I think of it, we need to go out and run the experiment.
I do know that horses in urban areas, which was a big, there was a big waste problem because horses were the engines of urban and rural, manufacturing, transportation, et cetera. And I know that there were all kinds of, in addition to the poop problem, which was massive, there was a big noise problem. Like, I think it was hospitals maybe had all kinds of like no horse zones because the clanging of the horseshoes on pavement was so loud that it would, I don't know, upset the surgeon or whatnot. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was brothels that didn't want it. I don't know. But anyway, somebody didn't want horses.
So speaking of horses, speaking of segues, I think I think there are a lot of things that are popular when they're adopted because either they're new and exciting or they are the best option on the market. But at some point, something better comes along, and yet people have this incredible financial and emotional investment in the prior practice, right?
Sure.
So one of these that drives me crazy is open plan offices.
Right.
So basic idea is pretty simple, right? We want people to have more creative collisions. We want people to interact more. And then Ethan Bernstein just ran this experiment where a company went from cubicles to open plan. And people had 70% fewer face-to-face interactions afterward. And they sent more emails. And I think this was just them throwing their hands up and saying, I cannot handle all the overstimulation. I need to focus. So let me just get into a zone here and get out of my face. Why do you think this fad persists? I guess it's cheaper to have open plan offices.
Yeah, so it's definitely cheaper. So I want to get to this, but there's something you said that I think is worth just thinking about for a second. Also, additionally, it is like you raise an incredibly important point, which is when something new comes along, whether it's prima facie better than or worse than the other thing. Let's say it's prima facie better, and people don't want to replace it. I think the key thing, this isn't the case in every instance, but the people with the leverage to make the change or not make the change are often not the people who are responsible for the new thing. So like whether it's in government, any kind of public policy, education, and I think that is like, I mean, economists, this is not quite exactly, economists talk about the principal agent problem, where two parties might seem to be aligned in what they're going for, but in fact, a lot of people in positions of power and leverage are kind of mid-career, they got there, they got theirs, and the only thing they don't want to do is like now change the way everything is done, because that will inevitably undercut their own, not inevitably, but in many cases it's seen as a threat to their own thing. So I think that is a huge problem in any kind of, public health, public policy, et cetera, et cetera. So like in terms of the open office thing, I don't think it's that complicated. So I know the Ethan Bernstein study, and Ethan and somebody, who else was?
Stephen Turbin.
Okay. Yep. And it was a really interesting finding to see that people wanted less face-to-face interaction. I mean, to me, there are a number of substrata that are interesting to think about, including, well, wait a minute. Me personally, I hate face-to-face interaction. Not that I hate people, although kind of. I like people individually, but collectively, not. In practice, I like people. In theory, I don't.
I have so many questions right now, but keep going.
But really, face-to-face communication is wonderful for some things and terrible for other things. Well, for work, depends what your work is. But if I'm a writer and I have 10, let's say, tasks to accomplish in a given part of the day, I'm going to say 9 of those are better accomplished without face-to-face. So why on earth do I want that? So if I have an option to put on headphones and eliminate all the time wasted, eliminate all the chit chat, eliminate all the I'm worried about the nonverbal stuff going kind of wrong. So I think there are potentially a lot of upsides to that. In terms of like why it persists, I actually do think that if you care about creating an office environment that works the best for the most people most of the time, it's not that hard. And I think a lot of modern office design is doing it now, which is basically some kind of hybrid model, which is open so that you feel part of a community, blah, 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 blah. Architects are really smart and getting really good at directing traffic to, so let's say that you have a mostly open place, but with, let's say, higher walls, right? So kind of higher than the new cubicle, maybe lower than the old cubicle. But that when people are in their tunnels to get someplace, the place that they most end up is the coffee or snack area, so that becomes the communal thing. But then you need to have like the quiet rooms, which I know are called something different in every place. We always, at WNYC, they were called the crying rooms because people were always, like they did nothing in there but weep, which is why we had to leave WNYC, all these weeping people coming out of these little rooms that were supposed to be set aside for work. But so I don't think this is a particularly hard problem to solve if you want to solve the problem. But if you just want to cheap out, then it's a real problem. And then there's also the work that I'm guessing you know well by Nick Bloom in China, who did this really good study about working from home.
In call centers,
Yeah, and it turns out that some people are much more productive working from home, and they love it. And there's obviously opportunity cost of traveling, et cetera, and cost of traveling, but not everybody. No. So again, there's a variance in humankind, and there's heterogeneous preferences. Yep. And if you're a really, I think, smart person, whether it's in your family, in your business, as a student, as a business person, whatever, you have to understand that different people have different abilities, ideas, and some people may change over time too. So that said, I work mostly on my own about 94% of the time. And then the 6% I go in with my awesome crew, and I kind of love it. I mean,
Yeah, that says the guy who blah, 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 having community at work. Yes.
Yeah.
So a couple things. One, I think what you just said also goes to another Ethan study, which is that if you're working solo, you have more great ideas, but fewer good ideas. And you get the opposite if you're brainstorming in a group, but you can get the best of both worlds with intermittent collaboration.
Interesting, yeah.
And that's kind of obvious, right? Like, of course, there are times when we need to be alone. There are times when we need to be in a team. I think the mechanism, though, is really interesting, that if you're in a team that's brainstorming together all the time, the less creative people, they just copy the ideas of the most creative people. Whereas if you let them work separately, they actually come up with ideas of their own, and they're able to enhance the creativity of the most creative people.
That's really interesting. So would the mechanism by which they fail or by which they copy be that they are sort of intimidated, that they're risk averse?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So I don't know if you've written about this or where I've read it, but I do know that like meeting culture generally, which, like it's really easy to slam it because it's been mostly bad for a long time. Although I do think that people are getting better at it. But one really basic piece of advice that I read that I thought was brilliant, so simple in retrospect, is, so I think about it like this. What are the odds that the quiet, shy, non-bravado possessing person has a worse idea than the noisy, cocky, well-presenting person? And I would say probably the correlation is negative. In other words, if you're the kind of person who's quiet and thoughtful and maybe shy, you probably spend a lot more time actually thinking, period, just thinking, as opposed to the noisy people. And I don't want to...
You just threw every extrovert under the bus.
Well, extroversion is really useful for some things, and extroverts are, there are heterogeneous, there's heterogeneity within extroversion too. But the fact is and to further slander a group of people, being males are much more likely to be the big, noisy So basically, I'm sure you know all these studies. I'm sure you've done some of these studies. You take the average man into a presentation among a bunch of people and have him deliver words that are total gibberish, and he will still be ranked as kind of smarter and more competent than a woman who's actually delivering something that's kind of perfect, okay? And then add a British accent, and that man is unstoppable. So there are all these, as we all know now. I mean, the world has really changed. These biases, these preconceptions, and the more you're aware of them, the better. But the thing that made me... the strategy that I thought was so simple and so brilliant is when you have the quiet person at a meeting, or maybe the shy person or the young person or the less experienced person, it's very simple to say, if after 15 minutes you haven't heard from that person, just invite them. Hey, Harry, what do you think of, Harry, I haven't heard from you, what do you think about it? There are a million ways to do it that doesn't feel like singling out, putting you on stage. And if they don't want to contribute, then fine, they don't. But to be invited to do that, I think is because I once we once wrote a story about a hospital that was trying to cut down on trying to increase rather hand hygiene rates, and the person who ultimately came up with the solution after many failures was the epidemiologist at the hospital, who was just by nature a kind of studious, quiet person. But it took until all the noisy ideas had failed, months and months, before she even had the kind of, I guess, maybe courage. And I think that's an easy remedy to a problem that is pretty large.
It is. I also, I've been kind of toying with a few other solutions to this problem. One of them is to take these sociometric badges that were invented at the MIT Media Lab, where you can have everyone in the room wear them. Humanize, I think, puts them out now, right? And then it displays in real time how much talk time each person is commanding. And you pretty quickly see, like, wow, I'm the idiot who's dominating the conversation. I also, when I have groups brainstorm, I don't let people present their own ideas. I at least want to decouple, okay, who generated the idea and then, who's selling it. And my hope is then if there's a really good presenter, every once in a while, a good idea will randomly land in their hands and they get to pitch it.
That's a really neat idea. How have you measured the degree to which that works?
I haven't yet, but I've taken, it's just been a simple sort of early, it's pre-experiment. But early tests to say, okay, look, we know there's zero, if not negative, correlation between the quality of your ideas and the quality of your pitching. So
yeah, I mean, to me, another really easy remedy for whether it's brainstorming or for like whether it's an internal prediction market at a firm or whatnot, is anonymity is great. So I know that when I read anything and I know who wrote it, which you almost always do, not always. Sometimes you're reading stuff online and you get there somehow and you read it and I'm really interested. Then I go back and maybe I think it's really good, maybe I think it's really bad. But usually when I'm reading something, I know who it is, and it's a huge problem because I carry all those biases in. So we should think about that, Allison, about like scrambling. But you can tell by the language too, and you can tell by the people who don't know how to use a semicolon. So they give themselves away. There are all kinds of tells in our business.
I got a draft back of an article recently, and there was a new paragraph added in, and I loved it. And I was like, this is the best paragraph I've read in a long time. My team wrote back and said, yeah, that was the one you suggested a few months ago. I was like, oh, yes, we all have these biases, that's for sure. And I don't know if I just appealed to my own taste better or if it was really any good.
Maybe it was just like a familiar voice. You know?
I think that's right. So I want to get to a couple other fads. But before we do that, I was really intrigued by something you said about middle managers. Because there's about half a century of evidence on what you know probably is called middle status conformity coming out of sociology, showing that if you are at the top, you have very little to lose by taking a risk, trying something boldly creative. And if you're at the bottom and you take a risk, you don't really have anywhere to fall. Like this stage we're sitting on is about a foot high. Like you fall off that, you're going to be fine, right? But poor middle managers have spent 5, 10, 20 years working their way to that position. And they have a lot to lose by taking a risk. And they're also, of course, often selected to move up that way by their ability to conform and enforce routines and norms and rules. Do you have any thoughts on how to open the minds of middle managers?
I mean, no.
That's not helpful.
But I mean...
Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Dubner.
But the knee-jerk response would be, incentives, because that's what, economics believes in incentives. The problem is when you talk to people in firms about incentives, they usually hear financial incentives, whereas in fact, as you well know, and as you've shown in your work all over the place, there are all different kinds of incentives. There are social incentives and moral incentives and reputational incentives and so on. And I do think that within firms, if we're talking about firms, and again, I've been around a lot of firms. I used to have a job a long time ago. I did not like having jobs, which is why I don't have one anymore. I'm also not good at having jobs. Because I like to say what I really thought at meetings, which I realize that's not what meetings are for. I also had one of the best worst moments was I was at the New York Times Magazine, which I loved, and the people there were brilliant. It was a lot of fun. But one time we had I learned a great lesson. We had a cover story fell through. I don't remember the circumstances, but somebody had gotten arrested or died or politically something had blown up, whatever. So the story that was going to run on the cover of the magazine like 2 or 3 weeks was not going to happen, and we needed something. And usually those cover stories took like 3 to 6 months to generate. So we needed an idea that could be created really soon. And so the editor-in-chief, wonderful guy, amazing journalistic pedigree, et cetera, said, okay, all hands on deck, all ideas. There is no such thing as a bad idea, which everybody has heard, right? So I was relatively new there, and I was the youngest person in the room, and I'd had this one idea that I thought would be a really good idea for the magazine. And so I thought, well, but I worried that it was a terrible idea. So I hadn't brought it up at these pitch meetings before, but I thought, now is my chance. He just said it. There's no such thing as a bad idea. So I kind of raised my hand. I gave my idea. And then he said, actually, I take back what I said. There is such a thing as a bad idea, and that was a brilliant example of it. So he managed to compliment me somehow by insulting me. So why did I get there? Oh, yeah. So the problem is, as you said, all that is the kind of incentive that creates conformity. I think what works really well, Colin Kammerer, whose work I'm guessing you know well, I don't know if he's ever written about this. It was something I was talking to him about a long time ago. Colin Kammerer is, I guess, an economist by training who is also super mathematical and graduated college at the age of like 8 or something. And then he decided that he wanted to learn about the relatively new field then of neuroimaging, fMRIs and so on. And he decided to like educate himself in the science of that, which he did, and he's at Caltech. So he's very, very brilliant and very thoughtful on a number of levels. And I was talking to him years ago about this idea we talked about earlier here about fame and how it's one of these very strange commodities that from afar, whether afar in distance or afar in time, might seem to have great value, but that up close is actually costly. And he said, yeah, that's why what you really want is local fame. And I think he's so smart that he just kind of processed the whole thing and made up the phrase for it. Local fame, I've observed, not scientifically, but observationally over the years, local fame is incredibly powerful and desirable. It's why, like, you know, when you go home to your family and you've done something that they approve of, like, that feels incredibly good. And within a firm, even if it's within your little pod of 5 people or 8 people, forget about the whole company. So I think recognizing that kind of incentive, recognizing that kind of emotion, and trying to turn that into an incentive is the way to basically help people feel good about taking a risk that might result in that. And then there's also a science of how much do you praise someone who comes up with something that doesn't work out. And I think there's a lot to be, I think I would praise them more for that almost, because it takes courage to do that, and you need to be encouraged to do it. I mean, I think that parenting and corporate leadership should have a lot more in common, honestly. And somehow it feels like people assume that employees, once they get to be 22, 25, 30 years old, they don't have the needs that children do. They do. And I think that a lot of people are really short-sighted about treating people as the kind of needy, weird animals that we are.
I also find myself thinking a lot about prospect theory here and saying, okay, look, you know, we know from decades of Kahneman and Tversky that when people have a certain gain, they like to play it safe and protect it. And when people are facing a guaranteed loss, that's when they're willing to take a chance, right? So I find that a lot of middle managers are pretty happy with the status quo. And so trying to sell them on the benefits of a new practice or of walking away from an old fad, they're like, well, no, I kind of like things the way they are. Whereas if you can highlight the costs of sticking with the status quo and say, look, here's why this is a horrible idea, then they either get really excited about changing or they get extremely defensive. And one of the places I have seen the most defensiveness, I think, is around the idea of emotional intelligence. What is your take on emotional intelligence before I tip my cards a little bit here?
I know the phrase. I think I generally understand what it means. I hear it applied a lot by people who seem to think they know what they're talking about. But as my answer may imply, I guess I believe that it is a fairly squishy or not fully understand measure, if indeed it's measured in any systematic way. And yet, for all that, I would argue that mine is relatively low.
I don't know what to make of that, because if you said yours was high, I would say that's a sign that it's low. So if you say it's low...
I knew you would say that, though.
I think it's interesting. So emotional intelligence, I think, first of all, I think it gets defined as kind of a kitchen sink. And if we really want to get precise about it, I think it's 2 basic skills. There's maybe a third, but one is the ability to recognize emotions, right? So, you feel something negative, you know the difference between anger and anxiety, or you see somebody else's facial expression, or you hear their tone, right? And you can differentiate. And then the other piece of it is regulating emotions. Can you manage your own feelings, and also can you manage other people's feelings? And I think we're at a point now where we have roughly, 30, 35 years of wild enthusiasm for this in the corporate world. And I feel like my job as a social scientist is to say, what does the evidence really tell us? And let me just preface this by saying that if anyone listening is currently a member of an emotional intelligence cult, you may not like what I'm about to say. And so I want to offer some guidance using the skills of emotional intelligence for how to manage that. So the first step would be to recognize the emotion you're about to feel. It might be disgust with my forthcoming words, but it's probably not disgust, because disgust is usually for food, not for people and ideas. I'm guessing it's going to be hostility, which is directed toward other humans, right? So then the next step, once you've recognized it, is to analyze your feelings. And I think the best analysis of hostility comes from the psychologist George Kelly, who said that hostility is essentially an emotional reaction to having a belief that you know is wrong invalidated, but still wanting to believe it's right. And then the last step is to regulate it and say, okay, well, I've got to manage that feeling. Well, why am I hostile? Maybe I don't want to believe that emotional intelligence is not as important as I thought it was. But you know what? You've probably been okay with other updates in your beliefs over time, right? Stephen, are you okay with the fact that Pluto is no longer a planet?
Yes.
For example? Yeah, you came around to that. So maybe you can come around to this too. So I think the best analysis of emotional intelligence to date is Joseph and Newman. They analyze dozens of studies, thousands of people, and what they show is that emotional intelligence is related to higher performance in jobs where you have to manage emotions, shockingly. If you do sales, if you're a real estate agent, for example, but in jobs where there's not a lot of emotional labor involved, if you're a scientist, for example, or an accountant, the higher your emotional intelligence, the worse your performance. What do you make of that?
I mean, it sounds believable-ish. I mean, honestly, I got a little bit hung up on, I mean, I heard what you said and appreciate it. I did get a little bit hung up on the definition, honestly, because the minute you defined it as processing emotion and then regulating, I think, well, wait a minute, that's like an input and an output. And those shouldn't be the same thing. That's why it just feels to talk about it as a thing. I mean, which is my understanding, my strictures put around that is I recognize very narrow. But to me, that's like being a producer and consumer at the same time, or maybe at different times. So, but it becomes a lot more, it needs to be more complicated than that for me.
I think that's fair. And I would say, though, that what's interesting to me about the data is that finding holds for the different skills. So being able to recognize emotions and being able to regulate them, even if you separate them out, right? Knowing that some people are good at one but not the other.
Right.
Both of those are helpful in high emotion management jobs. And they seem to be counterproductive, or at least the data suggests that they have a negative correlation with performance in jobs that aren't heavily emotional.
Yeah. I mean, even though you trashed Myers-Briggs, I'm guessing that in your field, however, there must be massive value and upside in understanding whatever you want to call it, emotional intelligence or whatever, to understand how predictive it can be in understanding how a given person will respond within a particular career opportunity. Because, you know, I think that the way it is remarkable to me that as customized as our culture has gotten in matching different things, right? So consumer preferences, you can act on them really specifically. Like to have a digitally searchable universe of things that you need to acquire is a massively efficient upgrade over the way it used to be. I used to need a Sears catalog or whatever, and now, like, whatever I want, I can literally type it and find it. However, and I'm guessing you know well the work of Al Roth, who's he's actually not an economist by training, but he won a Nobel in economics, and he teaches economics, and he's a brilliant guy, and he's done most of his career in market design and matchmaking.
Like in medical residencies.
Medical residencies, organ donors, high school applications, many, many things. And basically, it took a guy like him to acknowledge, now granted, these environments are often complicated and with warped incentives and so on, but it takes a lot of work to create good matches, you know, period. And so I feel like our mechanisms right now for matching people, a person, and all their intellectual and emotional, et cetera, components to a work life that will be good for them and that they will be good at, I feel like we're really bad at that.
Horrible.
So what are you doing about that?
Nothing.
No, shouldn't that be like the grail of your people?
Yeah, although I don't think the matching question is nearly as interesting as the changing question, right? So I want to know, how do we,
changing your priors.
Yeah, whatever job you land in, how do we both mold the job to you and help you mold yourself to be effective in that job?
That would be, to me, a little bit like, if we're going to use a sport analogy, it'd be like, you know, I'm going to play 8 sports when I'm young and I want to be a professional athlete. How do I decide, and at what point do I decide to devote all my resources to the one? I mean, I believe hugely in, I don't like the word passion because it's become just like a greeting card word, but I do believe strongly in the idea of passion, and that it's really hard to get good at anything unless you love doing that thing. I mean, it's pretty basic, but a lot of people, I think, try to cheat themselves into thinking otherwise, into thinking that They want to do either the virtuous thing or the cool or reputationally satisfying seeming thing or the remunerative thing. And I'm not judging any of them, but it's a problem when you do that and you put a lot of resources into it, and then you get there and you turn out, wow, I'm really bad at this, or I really hate this. So I do wish there was more, I do wish there was a better understanding to help more people, especially, I mean, now look, I mean, it's very, very possible that we're sitting in a moment in time where 20 years from now, the main kind of job that existed for most of the last 150 years, which is making stuff or serving stuff or doing stuff for other people, that may just not, we may not need any of that. So that becomes a huge and obviously interesting and potentially really, really troubling question. So it would be good if we at base knew what a given person was at least crazy wild in love with doing, so that they could turn it into, if not a profession, at least a thing that they were so good at and so joyous about that at least they wouldn't go killing other people. I mean, I'm setting the bar quite low there, but that's, you know, it's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think so. Although I personally think that passion is probably a little bit overrated relative to talent. And this goes into another fad, right? 10,000 hours. So I'm sure you've read the David Hamrick et al. Meta-analysis looking at how much does deliberate practice really matter, and showing that it's highly influential for games, for definitely for music as well. It explains less than 1% of the variance in professional performance, though. Yeah.
So the poor 10,000-hour rule has just been like a piece of taffy or something. It's been pulled and stretched, then frozen, and then melted, and like it's come to mean a very, very, very basic thing to most people, which it was never meant to mean, okay? So like I know, you know, the work of Anders Ericsson and his cohort, who did really, really great research in many, many domains, and basically all they really argued was that if you want to be really, really good at something, you have to work really hard at it.
Who knew?
Right, who knew?
Earth-shattering revelation.
And there was one kind of paradox in there, which is that people who are innately really gifted, if they don't work hard, they're probably not going to end up being really good. So that is a little bit counterintuitive. But as we've written, I don't know how much Malcolm wrote about this, Malcolm Gladwell, because Outliers is probably the place where most people get their 10,000-hour rule knowledge from. I don't know how much he wrote about this. But yeah, if you measure the impact of, well, deliberate practice, but then a number of other things, other advantages that you might have. It depends what domain you're talking about, but sports especially. I mean, genes are killer, people. I mean, they are incredibly, and not just in physical stuff also. So I do think we proceed at our own, you know, peril by trying to, A, reduce anything like that to a formula because populations are heterogeneous, and B, trying to reduce a formula to such a simplistic version of it. So, but basically, yeah, talent really, really, really matters. So does discipline, so does creativity, so does deliberate practice, et cetera, et cetera. So really, I mean, the short answer is it's really, the outcome is pretty boring. If you read books like yours or read a book like Angie Duckworth's book, Grit, what you find is that people who get really, really, really amazingly good at something, they kind of did it all, often. Or at least, you know, if we want to make like 5 dimensions on which we're going to measure accomplishment, they were like at least a 7 out of 10 on all 5. So yeah, being, you know, fairly talented and really lazy is almost never going to work. But being really, really hardworking at, let's say, basketball, if you're not, you know, somewhat talented, is also not going to work.
So I think one other topic to raise on that, which is kind of fun from my perspective at least, is if you want to get better at something, a lot of people who are into the kind of matching that you talked about earlier they're just obsessed with learning styles. You see this in education a lot. It's found its way into the workplace. And so what you're supposed to do is first find out, am I a kinesthetic, auditory, or visual learner? And then I'll digest.
You're about to trash that, aren't you?
I'm totally going to trash it. But I'm supposed to digest that information, you know, through the learning style that's comfortable for me. And Harold Pashler and his colleagues did a massive review of all the evidence for decades, and they found no compelling evidence whatsoever that your so-called learning style has any implications for your actual learning. And I think some of that might be because, you know, if we think about it, there are probably times when you learn something better when it's harder for you, right? The more you have to struggle to comprehend something, the more you actually internalize it, as opposed to saying, this is a breeze, I don't really have to think about it much. The other thing that I think is fascinating about learning styles, though, is that some of it is just there's some tasks that are better learned in one medium than another. So actually, let's ask the audience to try something for a second. Can I ask all of you to think of a language that you speak fluently? Stephen, do you speak any languages other than English?
Barely English, no.
Okay.
No others, yeah.
Those of you who do, think of a language that you speak other than English, if you do. And let's take French, for those of you who are looking for a language. I want you to picture a perfect French accent. Okay, that didn't work, did it? Try drawing it. Okay, it doesn't work in the visual medium, does it? Okay, wait, now, try to do it kinesthetically. Can you stand up and act out a perfect French accent? Of course not, right? You have to hear it. And I think so many tasks work that way. That
You didn't give that. Somebody was about to stand.
Do you
and
think?
do French. Right there.
I wanna
Yeah,
see
there
it.
you go.
Thanks, Gabe. Knew I could count on you.
Nicely done.
But I think that there are a lot of tasks that actually work that way, right? There's some things we just have to learn by doing them, and others that we have to learn by hearing them or reading them. And so I would just love, as we wrap up this conversation, to know, how do we get this particular myth to go away?
So I trust you and believe you, but I'm not sure I fully embrace the concept. But the evidence I'm about to offer, I don't have massive familiarity with it at the moment, because this is something we wrote about a few years back, but the evidence was very compelling. And maybe it's so domain specific that your argument is much more common, and maybe this is one example where it doesn't work. But there is an outfit that's now called, I think, New Classrooms, and used to be called School of One. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but it operated from a very basic idea, which is basically the idea that you're trashing, which is that there are different, quote, learning styles. But basically, there were some educators who looked at kids trying to learn math. And these were mostly kind of kids who didn't come, low income, low education kids, and they were getting really, really stuck on math in like 4th, 5th, 6th grade, whatever. And the guy who originated it looked at what was actually happening in a classroom. And if you think about the kind of, think about it like an economist for a minute, and think about the inefficiency of that production mechanism. You've got 30, let's say, kids, and one instructor, and one mode of instruction, which is to illustrate it and describe it, and then let the participants kind of practice it and master it, and they all have to go at roughly the same pace. What are the odds that that's going to work out really well? So it's very easy to imagine how it wouldn't. So what he did is he totally fractured it and said, we're going to take smaller groups, split them up, and we're going to offer a bunch of different modalities of learning. Yeah. Some kids will do group learning, peer-led, teacher-led, virtual learning, game playing, blah, blah, blah. And then every day, every kid gets tested in that area to see how they did using which modality of learning. And then the next day, overnight, the algorithm writes your playlist for the next day to see what modality should you use to learn the next lesson. And that program showed really impressive gains, because it seems to say to me, and again, you may know more than I, or you may just disagree with it, it would seem to say that in that case, for 11-year-old kids learning math, indeed, there are some people, maybe it's not a learning style, maybe it's just like a personal comfort thing. Maybe they didn't like being surrounded by kids that they felt were smarter. Maybe they didn't like listening, maybe they hated the teacher. So it may be really hard to disentangle that.
Maybe it's even just a Hawthorne effect, right? That somebody paid attention to them, they let them be a little more engaged or exercise some individual discretion or preference, and then they're like, hey, this is more fun, it's not as bad as I thought.
I agree. So again, I totally believe, you know a lot more about this than I, so I totally believe that what you're saying is true, but I would be a little bit hesitant to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I also think of one more quick example I'll give, which is an N of 1, which is me. So I'm trying to learn to be a good golfer, and
Why? Sorry, I hate golf, but go on.
That was not very nice of you.
I just really hate golf.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I do love it. So I didn't love it. I didn't play it as a kid. I played baseball, and a baseball swing is not a good swing to repurpose into a golf swing, it turns out. Baseball pitchers are really good. Golfers usually, in part because they don't hit a lot. Also, their delivery mechanism is a little bit closer to a golf swing kind of mechanically, and they only work every 5 days, so they can play golf every day. So that's why most pitchers tend to be pretty good. But anyway, So like my wife happened to grow up as a ballerina. My mom was a ballerina. And the way they talk about moving their body with a kind of, there's a fancy phrase for it that I can never remember, about something about your mind telling a part of your body to do a thing, right? And partly they can do that because they've mastered it, because they've done it for hundreds and thousands of hours. But like when a golf instructor or a pro would say to me, what you really need to do is pronate your blank, or blank with your hips, or make the tension on your quads 10% less while you're on the So to me, there's certain things that are literally incomprehensible and even when I comprehend them, untranslatable.
Yeah. But I would say that's the task of learning golf. Right.
Well, no, because what I find, and that a lot of golfers find, especially if you're learning late in life, I think it's different when you learn it younger because the muscle memory is built very differently. But everybody learns to basically come up with your own translation. Oh, this needs to be the feeling, not like, so golf has all these absurd images of how you learn the swing. Like you should imagine that you lift your arms up and then you're holding onto the rope that's attached to a church bell, and then you ring the church bell down. It's absurd. Although at a certain point, you may find that that makes sense to you. So to me, what that's about is, again, heterogeneity. And I don't know if you would call it a learning style, but I do think, and I say this as a father of only 2 kids, my 2 kids could not have different sets of like preferences and abilities when it comes to different academic or other subjects. So I really, maybe it's just a Pollyannish philosophical embrace of the heterogeneous. I like living in a world where people not only have different capabilities, but different ways to exercise those capabilities. So again, you're the PhD, I'm nothing, but I'm gonna stick with my story.
I like your heuristic of deferring to the expert, almost deferring. But
I show very high emotional intelligence.
Clearly,
by doing so, don't
clearly.
I learned something here.
You should go right to the source for the accurate data on that one. I think it's interesting to me though that when I hear you talk about that, I'd say, all right, you know what? If you think about this, heterogeneity as a source of freedom, that's a good thing. What I worry about with learning styles is that they actually restrain people, right? So I have people come into my classroom all the time who will say things like, well, I'm just not an auditory learner, so I can't listen to a lecture. And the reality is, well, either the lecture needs to be better, or we should find some ways for you to pay attention differently, right? There's no reason why somebody should get away with saying, this is not the way that I like to learn.
Well,
and
what do you
therefore
mean get away with? Like you're worried that they're scamming you somehow?
No, I'm worried that they're limiting their own learning and they're closing the door to different ways of engaging because they say, I prefer to engage this way. That doesn't mean I can only learn that way.
And your view is that they have some aversion to it, and if they worked at it, they would master it.
Yeah, or just that you don't have to...
I definitely disagree with you on this one.
You do?
Because, yeah, totally. Because I think about podcasts. So I make podcasts, but I do not like podcasts. I'll say it right here. I do not enjoy listening to podcasts. They're too slow. Like
that's why we listen on 2X.
No. 2X just then makes it chipmunky. That's no better. What I mean by it is the amount of, for me, useful and or entertaining and or chuckle producing information that they deliver per second is really low for me. I'm just saying.
I think you're listening to the wrong podcast, Stephen.
Well, yeah, no, I've tried a few. So anyway, no, and I realize some of them are awesome, but I love reading the transcripts of those same podcasts that I wouldn't want to listen to. Why? Because I can read a lot faster and I can skim and scan. So are you telling me that I should just like get with the program and learn to listen slowly and be bored?
No, definitely not.
Right.
What I'm telling you is, though, that your learning actually might not be better in that reading and skimming that you're doing. You might enjoy it more, right? But you're not necessarily getting more out of it. I'd also say that what I've learned to love about listening to podcasts is I can listen when I'm at the dentist or when I'm taking out the garbage. I just love being able to learn and listen without having a screen.
Okay, so I go back to the source. I make it a point to not go to the dentist. I don't take out my own garbage. So I really feel like I'm solving your problems for you here by
mission
different
accomplished. One more thing before we wrap. Since you're trying to master golf, I have a very strong feeling that golf is not a sport; it's a game. And my rule is that if you can be drunk and still play it well, it's not a sport. And so golf belongs in the category with billiards and darts and poker. Agree or disagree?
I mean, if it's binary, I have to disagree, only because each of the 4 that you name, maybe darts and billiards, I would say, are relatively similar.
Bowling. maybe too.
Yeah, okay, so I would say darts, bowling, golf, maybe all. Interestingly, about all those three, no, not billiards, but interestingly, the parallel, or actually the orthogonality between darts and billiards and golf is interesting, which is that when you're throwing a dart, you're looking at the target, and when you're bowling, you're looking at the target. But with golf, you look at the ball instead, which is kind of necessary. But a lot of people now, with putting at least, are starting to look at the target, look at the hole, which is just an interesting kind of mental contortion that's been happening lately. So it's neat to see when something that's been around as long as that is being reappraised on that basic level. I don't care. I know a lot of people like to have the sport versus game argument. It's been going on in my circles for many years, and it includes NASCAR and Formula One, and everybody has their view on it. I don't really care. I will tell you something of more probably importance than my opinion is that my co-author on Freakonomics stuff, Steve Levitt, wrote a really nice paper about poker that ended up being significant in a legal argument about whether it was a game of chance or a game of skill. So that's a different argument than whether it's a game or a sport. But poker, I think anybody who knows even a little bit of poker has to acknowledge that there's a fair amount of skill involved. So if you want to call golf a game as opposed to a sport, I'm totally fine with that. The one thing I will challenge you on is nobody plays it as well drinking. And I know that because almost everybody I play with except me does drink when doing it. And that's why I play with them, is because they're all better than me. But because I know they're going to be drinking, I know that by the time we get to the end, I will be better than them. So that's, I feel bad that you've spilled my strategy. But that's the only way I can beat people, is to have them drink.
Then my work here is done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. This was fun. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.